And welcome to our web conference on creating protective environments for LGBTQ plus youth within schools and communities to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. My name is Ashley Klein Jimenez. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the US government, CDC, or Valor. And we do have some objectives for you today. So we're looking at being able to describe opportunities and challenges when thinking about adapting and creating violence prevention programs by and for LGBTQ plus youth and adults, looking at ways that violence prevention programming can prioritize prevention needs for LGBTQ plus youth, thinking and describing, identifying ways that adults can be better allies and role models, and really promote social norms that protect against violence for LGBTQ plus youth. And then we'd love to engage in a discussion about ways to really bridge the gap between gender transformative work, meeting audiences where they're at, and advancing prevention work that doesn't reinforce the gender binary. So yeah, easy things to do in 90 minutes, but we're excited to be able to have this conversation. I do want to share that the work, and Tori, you can go to the next slide, the work that our guests will be sharing today, it does touch on quite a few of the strategies and approaches in CDC's Stop SV and intimate partner violence across the lifespan technical packages, including creating protective environments, promoting social norms that protect against violence, and engaging influential adults. At the same time, though, relying on these strategies alone doesn't go far enough to prevent violence against LGBTQ plus communities. And Tori, if you'd go to the next slide, we know that sexual violence prevention efforts really need to work to end broader oppression against individuals while working to end violence, since it's all connected. And the graphic, one of the graphics that is on the screen by Lydia Guy Ortiz, illustrates that connection by clearly showing that oppression is a root cause of sexual violence, and norms that support gender inequities, hypermasculinity, and adherence to kind of these traditional gender roles, and just a general acceptance of violence are not only perpetuating sexual violence, but also contributing in real ways to homophobia and transphobia. So Tori, I want to hand it over to you to talk a little bit more about the norms that really work to uphold sexual violence, homophobia, and transphobia.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I mean, you set me up so well. I don't know if I have much to add other than this isn't new news, or I hope this isn't new news to folks, the connections between the norms that uphold sexual and intimate partner violence prevention and norms that uphold homophobia and transphobia. So I invite folks that if this is new news to you to check out the blog from Prevention Institute, where they identify and describe in a little bit more detail those 5 key norms that uphold violence. And I think when we're also talking about just the ways that resources in our field may or may not support preventing violence against LGBTQ plus communities, something that really comes to mind that we learned about, I want to say recently, it was pre-pandemic, so who knows when it was, is this study from Green Dot. So folks may be familiar with Green Dot, folks may be implementing Green Dot. Green Dot has really been upheld as a bystander intervention program for our field that we know is very highly utilized across the field. However, they just recently released a study saying that it is not effective at preventing violence against LGBTQ plus youth. So what does that mean for those who are implementing it? There is a little information from the abstract that I bolded on the screen about, what their suggestions are moving forward to have violence violence prevention programs that do prevent violence against LGBTQ plus youth. So I think, when we think about what are we doing for prevention, is our prevention working? We also need to be asking ourselves, who is it working for? I I was, if you all have been on recently, you know that I'm on an analogy and a story kick. So I'm going to keep it going here. I was thinking of like, what is a visual? What is an image that comes to mind when I think of, like you're doing it, but not quite. So when we're thinking about folks who are preventing sexual and intimate partner violence, like, yes, that's great, but are we preventing sexual and intimate partner violence against folks who are most vulnerable in our communities? And I immediately thought of my recent trip to Trader Joe's when someone was wearing one of those mesh face masks that's completely see-through, holes all over it. It's like a coronavirus, like fast track express lane. And so I thought this was a really great analogy when thinking about, are our prevention programs doing enough? So when I think of this, I think of like, yes, it's a face mask, but it's not enough to prevent COVID infections among those who are most vulnerable. What would make it more effective is adding another face mask that actually does prevent infections or prevent transmission to folks who are vulnerable of suffering dire consequences of COVID. And I feel like that's the same thing that we're talking about here when we're talking about violence prevention and making sure that the programs, the strategies, things like that we're doing are actually preventing violence. So, and I also think there's an element of like this face mask that I see. When I see it, I think, that's someone prioritizing their individual comfort, but it's coming at the sacrifice of the lives of people who are most vulnerable. And I think we can make the same comparison when it comes to violence prevention programs too. It's also really important to keep in mind that this is not a one-time conversation, nor should it be, because Ashley and I may look back, or someone else may look back at this recording in 3 years and be like, wow, that could have been a lot better. So this is the start of a conversation, or the continuation of a conversation of what are ways that we can improve safety and how we promote safety and promote violence prevention for everyone in our communities, but especially for those who are most vulnerable. So Ashley, I think you have another great analogy that you want to share with folks on this topic too.
Thanks, Tori. I don't think it's actually an analogy, but just kind of like to sum up what you were saying, that how we think about approaching our work, it really goes beyond like a curriculum or a program itself, and goes into, how and with who we work with to prevent violence. So I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, the environments that we're creating, who are they serving? Who are they protecting? And if the environment being created is not protective to people who are experiencing oppression, to me, that's not a protective environment at all, right? It actually won't prevent violence because it doesn't get to there. And so we've spent the last year really having to adapt and shift in many ways in how we approach our prevention work and how we think about prevention. And so I'm saying that I think we need to continue doing that. I think there's a lot of really great kind of insight and examples that we are going to hear from our guests about in just a moment. But before we get there, we'd love to hear from you all. And just to kind of start this conversation off, we'd love to know, what are some things that you are currently engaged in to prevent violence against LGBTQ plus communities? And so if you'd head over to the chat and let us know, what are you currently doing? We'd love to get a sense of what's happening out there. And we'll probably, Tori, I'm thinking we'll probably circle back and see what that conversation has been like in the text chat. But I think it might be a good time to introduce our first set of guests.
Totally agree. Let's do it. So, we are so excited to introduce you all to our guests joining us from Colorado. We have Ray joining us from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And we also have Goddess Taisha to share about what this work looks like in Colorado. And I am actually going to stop sharing my screen right now and allow Ray to share your screen. And Ray, if you're speaking, we cannot.
Mute button, my favorite. Lord. Thank you for being patient. Yeah, it is a Technology Tuesday. Thank you so much. I'm excited to see everything coming through in the chat. Got some great work going on around the country. So trigger warning, we're going to talk about gay sex, y'all. I think it's pretty safe to say we all experience challenging experiences when we engage outside of our field and our work and our professional circles, trying to navigate this triple taboo topic of sex and rape and LGBTQ plus identities. Never mind, we're all out here dancing around the stigmatized discussion where most people are going to feel scandalized or shut down and tune out, but we still need them to get on board with this work. So I guess my bigger question is, how do we get them through that response of fear and discomfort and shutting down? And without taking up time and space to unpack, centuries of systemic factors behind reproductive injustice and discrimination, we can still continue to move our work forward and avoid their avoidance and ignore the ignorance, at least until we get to a place where people can both understand and accept difference. So what I mean is this: despite the LGBTQ plus community being at higher risk and reporting higher experience of sexual violence, which then leads to greater experiences of trauma, which then leads to further risk behaviors, the factors that are going to reduce our risk and the factors of stronger protection extend to everyone. Enhancements to LGBTQ plus safety benefit all sexes, orientations, and gender identities, which is everyone. Now, Ashley spoke a little bit earlier about the concept of shared risk and protective factors and how they inform prevention and the perpetuation of violence, but also other behaviors and outcomes. None of these are exclusive to LGBTQ plus identities. So if we approach LGBTQ plus safety just a little differently, equity is embedded in that connected concern and the protective factors that we all share. And nobody clutches their pearls because suddenly it's a gay thing and they get offended. So what I mean is this: like the risks of commercial tobacco, substance, or alcohol misuse, suicidality, depression, anxiety, multiple other risks, we all share that. The same protections of trusted adults, social connectedness, safer schools, communities, places to live, work, and play, those support us all. And safety extends beyond the individual. It enhances safety for everyone in the young person's life as we increase protective factors and reduce those potentials for risk. But also, I have to say this, the reality is that for some of us, our identity may be the risk factor, unless you're a white-bodied cishet male, and then I suppose it's a protective factor in it. But the urgency to address prevention with equity and a priority for the impacts of how our health is more about health being a privilege and a luxury versus our individual choices for our health. It's not only best practice, but it's a requirement for our Colorado grantees. Why? Is because we have to look at all these pieces of the puzzle to fully correct the disparities of access and affordability to basic human needs and services. To say it simply, let's be real. The neighborhood that's got a ton of liquor stores, marijuana dispensaries, cheap fast food, and really sketchy, unsafe housing is not the one that has the great innovation school, the mental health services, parks, and the fancy new Whole Foods and gym. Health and safety aren't a luxury, but our country treats them as so. And so it comes down to this, and Ashley also spoke to this previously. Violence equals domination and control of other devalued bodies. whether that's against that body's race, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, gender identity, class, ability, size. It's all white supremacy concepts that hold us captive under these Eurocentric norms of violence, oppression, colonization, and what the author Sonia Renee Taylor calls body terrorism. Schools in every community can be hostile and unsafe for LGBTQ plus youth. They're captive in school to experience toxic social norms around gender roles, homophobia, transphobia, and then layered on top of that, many don't have access to the in-school resources that would improve school climate and student experiences. Anti-racist and anti-oppression work is LGBTQ plus sexual violence prevention work. There's an incredible guiding resource. It's the suite of reports that GLSEN released, it was about a year ago, examining the experiences and safety perceptions of LGBTQ youth of color. You can get to these papers at GLSEN, glsen.org, under their research tab, and then search Erasure and Resilience. That's the name of this package. And the reports are summarized into one publication, and then also available separately in their entirety by racial, ethnic, and cultural group. Because when you consider the history of violence in our society, in addressing safety and prevention, you can't remove race and culture. Being Black and brown and queer is unfortunately the same as having a giant neon target of intersectional identities drawn on your back. Now, to be clear, intersectionality is not intersection, and too often I hear it used this way, but intersectionality is not where we collide with each other in the sense of all lives and all isms and all offenses merit your equal outrage. It's way more complex, like the layers of the onion or the links in the chains and shackles on your people. It's the number of societal strikes against you, against me. Intersectionality is the stacked deck of cards, and some of us are not even going to get dealt in because of our identities. In looking at the graphic on the left, I want to point out it's not a pass-through or a point of convergence and stopping together at the center. It's not a flat two-dimensional model. Think of intersectionality more as overlapping layers and petals increasing in mass. Intersectionality exists in 3 dimensions because, well, so do we. And the more systemic factors are piled against your multifaceted identity, the bigger the burden of oppression you carry in life. So then, with intersectional and anti-racist, anti-oppressive lensing, here's some of the changes and highlights and policies made by Colorado's RPE grantees. And there are more. These are just a handful of my favorites, like bilingual signage in community spaces for a population that was split English and Spanish speaking. Support for pronoun usage, GSAs and affinity clubs. Hotspot mapping taking place virtually in social media spaces, not just physically. And intentionality around LGBTQ inclusivity on the YRBS survey. Our version is the Healthy Kids Colorado survey. And this is going to give us better ability to cross-tab the survey data into our populations of priority and understand what is the burden, what is the need, and how can we address that best. Now, GSA and cultural clubs offer incredible results just for letting youth take initiative and lead together. Modeling and supporting pronoun use and pushing for practices and policies around pronouns is free. And it reduces suicidality in queer and trans youth by about 67%. You see, affirmations of someone's identity, all identities, are a basic human need. We exist to know that our existence is valid. These 2 steps I just named, GSAs and pronouns, are easily available and provide so much prevention for youth. I'm particularly excited about one accessibility change that one grantee did around unhoused youth who needed to access basic human services, whether that be clothing, food banks, showers and other hygiene access, medications, transportation, etc. Now, in the past, the reason this matters so much to me is youth without ID couldn't access these services without giving physical identification, but often that same youth had been kicked out of their family home, didn't have time to collect up their ID documents in a rush. So a lack of identification would then result in bartering with others to access necessary services, or required an interaction with law enforcement. So by helping remove that barrier to accessing services without the ID requirement, it eliminated that risk of sexual violence victimization that took place in bartering for services. There's the quote from the notorious RBG, women belong in places where all decisions are being made, which also makes me think of another slogan used in the disability community, that nothing about us without us. That is to say, LGBTQ plus sexual violence prevention is equity work. Race, gender, and disability exclusions are written into the very founding documents of this country, and all are acts of violence against bodies deemed to be lesser. So we absolutely cannot approach our sexual violence prevention work without active anti-racist, anti-oppressive demands to dismantle the very culture of subjugation and kleptocracy that born and raised us on the concepts of violence and domination. And so in our work in Colorado, our challenge to ourselves, our grantees, and now the challenge I make to you is, where are there opportunities to center anti-oppression in your work? How can you decolonize violence prevention and decolonize yourself? I'm going to stop my screen share and give it right back to Tori, because I brought a friend with me today that I'm really excited for y'all to hear from.
And I'm really excited to hear from your friend too. Ray, I have chills. That was incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much for opening up our web conference that way and really putting the necessity of the challenge out there. I really appreciate that. Goddess Taisha, we're coming to you next. Did you want to, you're sharing your slides. Great. So while you're getting comfortable over there, Ashley and I wanted to highlight some of the responses we got from our first text chat question. So Ashley, what were some themes that you saw coming up?
Oh, thanks for asking, Tori. Yeah, I was making notes because there was a lot, but I saw a lot of people describing different partnerships with LGBTQ plus centers, movements, GSAs. I love, there was a response that said, not enough, like very honest, not enough. Other folks are hosting groups and support groups for trans and gender nonconforming youth. There was an example of having funding to be able to provide gender affirming clothing. And I thought that was such an example of an action behind one of the things that Ray said: we exist to know that our existence is valid. There was some examples of educating oneself more, social media engagement to try to spread education amongst community members, working on other health and equity issues impacting LGBTQ plus youth and communities. There was an example about breaking down gender binary approaches and engaging men and boys work. So those are some of the themes I saw. And then, there were some others about, putting a pride flag in a school, or making, normalizing the use of pronouns. So those are some things I saw. Tori, what about you?
Yeah. Again, like such a great, great summary and great pivot to me that I don't have too much to add. I do really want to appreciate the honesty that came out in the chat for people to admit that, I'm not there yet, but this is why I'm here today. And really want to thank folks for being open and honest about that. And I know Ray had talked about the importance of pronouns and, affirming folks' existence. So I want to uplift that too, but I also want to challenge folks to think of ways that they can go beyond using gender neutral names and pronouns in programs and activities. I feel like it reminds me of when the movie The Happiest Season came out, I was so excited to see that representation, to see two women loving women in a relationship with one another, and for it to be in a cheesy holiday movie. I was so excited to like see myself in a cheesy holiday movie. But then I was so let down by the lack of healthy relationships shown on screen. And I think about that a lot when it comes to like the prevention work that we do. Pronouns are a great way of representation when we use gender neutral pronouns and gender neutral names or gender expansive names in our programs. But representation alone is not prevention. Representation is necessary. It's a piece of prevention, but that alone is not prevention. So I just really, I want to thank folks for being, very honest and vulnerable in the chat and letting us know about that. And with that, I'm going to mute and let Goddess Taisha let us know more about the work that's happening at Inside Out in Colorado.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Are we good? Yeah, we're ready to rock and roll. If I start talking too quickly because I'm New York Rican, feel free to slow me down. And also if you can't hear me, sometimes my Wi-Fi gets spotty. That means I have to hold my hands and stand like this and sit like this so you can hear me, because I might be cutting off. Am I cutting off? People look kind of weird. Hopefully not. Sweet. Yes. We're good vibe. Happy Tuesday. Hi. My name is Goddess Taisha. I use they, she, ella, and Goddess and Taisha. So all of those bienvenidos are more than welcome to be used. I'm the Amplifier of Health Advocacy at Inside Out. And I'm gonna be real, just to be transparent emotionally, I am a little bit nervous. I don't usually get nervous because I do presentations at least 4 to 5 times a week, but I'm so excited to be here with everyone and kind of talk a little bit about what Inside Out is doing. I'm gonna be honest, I have to praise Ray for so many reasons. Ray, not only for us being under such a wonderful team of folks that are here to support us on a continuous basis, but also the lens that Ray used during the session. You can notice that Ray is building onto what that might look like in other spaces, right? As all the grantees need that support in a different way. And we meet on a continuous basis and have these conversations about how we're serving the Colorado community. I particularly live in Colorado Springs, so that's a spicy area. It is not Denver. And we're going to talk a little bit about more upstream prevention that we're doing here in Colorado Springs to kind of promote what it looks like in a conservative space as well. I saw that some people were speaking about like safe dates and comprehensive sexual education. So happy. It made me so happy. I was like, yes. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and the reason why that's super, uber, duper important. But a lot of folks are doing a lot of great work. I also want to say thank you for the vulnerability of being honest about where you are as an agency, right? Because even as Inside Out, we have to do that, right? We have to kind of evaluate how are we looking at all of these systems of oppression and how are we deframing that? Because the reality is, even as queer people, we have biases. We were born into this society that told us certain things, and we perpetuate those pieces, right? The reality is that trans folks still do not have the equality that cis, white, male, gay folks do, right? And why is that when we got our liberation from trans Black women? Hello, right? The reality is that these systems are embedded in all of these pieces. And so when we have these conversations, they're a little bit more robust. And I really love the artichoke, not only because I enjoy artichoke, but also because the reality is that it is very multi-layered, right? The reality is that I am a cis assumed privileged Black feminine presenting person, right? But I am also Puerto Rican. I am also a New Yorker. I am also part of 145th Street between 7th and 8th. Those are all different cultures that when I look at society, the way society treats me, the way I interact with society has to do with those intersectionalities, and they distinctively play a role, right? The fact that I am dyslexic and the fact that I speak 3 languages, those are all difficulty points, right? And so when we have these conversations, we have to be really transparent. And then on the flip side of that is that I live the privilege. I have a dual master's from Fordham University, right? I'm a highly educated person that had the capacity to wake up with shelter, have a car, right, that I can click into. I have coffee, I have accessibility to so many things. So it's also about knowing what privileges we do hold, and how do we build those skates for everyone? How do we share those privileges, right? And how does allyship look, and now becoming an accomplice? And we're going to talk about that at the end of kind of these pieces that I'm trying to put together. So has anybody ever heard of Inside Out? I love to say that. Thumbs up if you've ever heard of Inside Out. If you have heard of Inside Out, you're so cool. Can I just say? If you haven't, now you have. So now you're cool. Welcome. Feel free to actually, I don't know what you're doing online these days, but if you're not following Inside Out on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or any those pieces, then you know, who are you following? LinkedIn, hello, come and follow us, right? We like to give a lot of different resources, and we're really excited to share with community and be there to be accessible to the community and the community at large, not only Colorado. So Inside Out has been in existence for 31 years here in El Paso County, which is Colorado Springs, as most of the country might know us as. We're a nonprofit organization that serves LGBTQ plus youth. We provide safe spaces, accepting spaces. We have extended our services to the age of 24. It used to be till 22. The reason why is because we're seeing huge amounts of disparities with young adults, right? The reality is that the cost of living is unmanageable. Not a conversation being had enough. We talk about the disparities of poverty, right, or classism. We offer mental health resilience, suicide prevention program, safe dating, and comprehensive sexual education, because that's what upstream prevention looks like. Support groups for our trans and gender non-binary youth, and social opportunities. We are right now on Discord because young people are resilient, and 2 seconds later, they were online. What I do for Inside Out is that I try to make sure that we will not exist to the same capacity in the next 10 to 15 years. I am trying to work myself out of this job, because the reality is that we should not still be having this conversation. Sorry to tell you, right? The reality is that we should not be having a session just for LGBTQ+. We should have made a society that's so open and affirming, and so created so many safe spaces that our agency does not have to go out there and teach these things, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We have a lot of professionals here, so I'm not going to go too much into the statistics, okay? And these slides will be shared. But I just want to honor the fact that we understand that the intolerance kills. The reality is that anti-LGBTQ+ discrimination in the community has been linked to higher risk of suicide, as well as poor mental health and substance abuse. When we talk about intolerance kills, we have noticed that during our last term in policy, high numbers of suicidal ideation, high numbers of mental illness, high numbers even of sexual violence, because the reality is that when we're building policy that's not inclusive to everyone, people suffer. So intolerance kills in huge numbers. Education is something that I do. It's one of the buckets of work that I do. We do it with CDPHE as well. It's a different department because CDPHE is so supportive to making inclusive spaces. And we build trusted adults. So part of that is this approach of like, yes, we can give direct services, but we also have to recognize that we live in a very intolerant society. And so we need to build the education components of how to be a trusted adult. Guess what? If a young person is willing to talk about marijuana or sex, or asks you, hey, when was the last time you smoked pot? I'm coming from Colorado. The realism is that 50% of the work has been done. They see you as a trusted adult, right? And how do you navigate that conversation instead of not having it? We as adults have been taught that everything feels uncomfortable, right? And the minute something feels uncomfortable, we shouldn't have that conversation. But the reality is that we do a dishonor to our young people when we're not willing to have the conversation, because as we know, if they don't get the information from us, they're going to get it from somewhere else. They're going to go on the internet. And when it comes to sexual violence, what we're seeing is that they're getting their sexual education from the internet, which is the reason why we are seeing such high numbers of sexual violence, because as we know, the internet does perpetuate sexual violence, right? And so when we start to link these things together, we have to realize that part of our work when we talk about upstream prevention is not only saying, okay, I'm going to give you a direct service. Okay, I'm going to honor your pronouns. Okay, I'm going to fulfill the need here. We have to go out into our communities and hold folks accountable of how they're treating our young people in other spaces. That is accomplished work, right? That is not, now you're not only doing allyship, which is putting a flag up, which I appreciate. I mean, you know, I got my flag up all the time. But the reality is that if you're not protecting young people, then this flag means nothing. Please don't put it up. The reality is that we have to be more transparent about this work, and we no longer need people that are going to be complicit. So part of this work is educating folks, right? And every single time having the opportunity to stop and let's educate, let's have these conversations. These are difficult conversations, but we need to have them. We also do LGBTQ 101s, 102s, 103s, which in Colorado Springs means I teach a lot of people what lesbian means. And I know for some people around the country, that's like, what? Yes, people don't know what lesbian is or what bisexuality is. And sometimes we have to start there, right? So that then we can start having those conversations, those really rich conversations about the difference between sexuality and gender. And the fact, I like to throw in little statistics, like, for instance, the most people that are seeing the most amount of violence in the queer community are Black trans females. Why is that, right? Because we have built a structure to attack all of these intersectionalities. I also like to bring things back, such as your bathroom is an all gender restroom. So what is the issue with having an all gender restroom everywhere else? Unless you have a gender specific restroom in your house. I know I don't. The reality is that we have this built understanding of the way societies are supposed to work, and we have to deframe this. And part of the ways that we deframe it here at Inside Out is through doing education. Young people need trusted adults. The reality is that the more trusted adults that young people have, just in general, it's kind of, I think Tori might have said something, or Ashley, around this. The reality is that when we build safe spaces for LGBTQ plus youth, when we break racism, when we break all the ism, xenophobia, all of those pieces, the people that actually benefit the most are cis white males. Let's do it. Let's just make this happen, because the reality is that we need this for our society to move forward. What we see in the queer community, and just to kind of go back, some of the prevention work that we did when we started with CDPHE was around a lot of suicide prevention. El Paso County has some of the highest suicide rates in the country. And last year, unfortunately, we doubled in suicide, and we don't even include 18-year-olds. I'm going to be honest, which are part of young people, right? We know that youth go from 9 to 25 on a national basis. So I can't even imagine what those numbers look like. And the reality is that we had to use suicide prevention because people in our county, in our city, do not want to talk about queer people. They want to leave the gays over there. Right? They don't really exist. We just got out of a state that actually now you cannot shoot us just because we gay, or we told you we were gay, because we just 2 years ago, we could go, me and you can go on a coffee date and I could tell you were gay, you could shoot me in the face, and you had every legitimate reason because you were in shock. We just got rid of certain laws. So I say all of that to say that young people come with a backpack. You don't know what they've experienced, right? Because our society has been so intolerant. So I want to say, when you meet the queer community, part of upstream prevention to me is also not to realize that they have a heavier backpack than what you're going to see when it comes to cisgender straight folks, right? They might have dealt with intolerance in a much bigger magnitude. And it's about recognizing possibly that backpack and how that might look. Sexual violence. I'm not going to go too much into it because I see a lot of professionals here, right? And but the reality is that comprehensive sexual education saves lives. Cis lives. It saves cis lives, okay? When we talk about some of the sexual violence things that we're doing at Inside Out, is that now we're starting to look at policy. Colorado State doesn't have any comprehensive stalking law. If you were to be stalked in Colorado State, you would have to actually get a DV case for it to go anywhere. And the DV case has to be physical, because the reality is that we have not built comprehensive policy enough to say that if someone is in a sexual violent situation, it doesn't have to necessarily be physical, right? We can honestly say that two people can have sex and you might not have any physical evidence of that. In Colorado State, we don't have that. We don't have that comprehensive policy. So part of our work has really started to become, how do we build more policy, not only in all gender restrooms, which is epic work and we have to do, not only building GSAs, epic work like Ray was talking about, those statistics right on point, but then also how are we building policy that's going to be safe for everyone, right? because we are at a disenfranchisement when it comes to legislatively having policy that's going to protect folks. Some of the building inclusive policy is all gender restrooms, recommendations of GSA and hotspotting. Those that don't know what hotspotting is, it is a national program that basically uses the environment to show factors of how, of what feels safe and what doesn't. And guess what it does? It uses young people as experts. The reality is that you know which 7-Eleven you feel comfortable in and which one you don't. And you know why you know that? Because instinctually, you know what feels safe and what doesn't. We need to realize that young people are experts. They don't need us to come and tell them what to do. They really don't. They might need a little bit of guidance, but they're experts. They are experts of their community, of their environment. They know where and where not to go. So we use them as experts to tell us where they feel best. And then we make recommendations to schools, to the city, to agencies, right? And we also highlight organizations or businesses that are actually doing really good work for the LGBTQ youth, but not only LGBTQ youth, all youth. We do this with all youth because the reality is that intersectionality work is so imperative. We've made recommendations for English language learners at schools. We've made recommendations towards racism happening embedded into the culture of our schools. And how do we support those? How do we support those institutions? We do a lot of education components and we build policy that's going to be more inclusive. Comprehensive sexual education, I cannot emphasize that enough. Building policy around names and preferred pronouns. The reality is that people are using their dead names on WebEx right now. Imagine coming onto WebEx every single day as a student and misuse of pronouns and names. Very traumatizing, right? And then also dealing with some other things like what goes on the diploma, what is on their transcript, right? And we do a lot of that through our Safe at Schools Coalition, which we're on our 10th year anniversary, yay. And through that coalition, we try to talk out how do we build comprehensive policy, because actually Colorado Springs has over 10 districts in this one little area. And what happens is that it's the wild, wild west, y'all. Everyone has their own way of doing things. And so the reality is that we've had to figure out coalition work that's going to be efficient for everyone that's seeing very distinct things. More comprehensive policy around sexual violence and also houselessness. The reality is that statistically, 34% of houseless folks are queer, right? And we're seeing such high numbers. We only have one houseless shelter here in the Springs, and it only holds 20 young people for only a certain amount of time. The police are now going into the parks and dragging our young people out of the parks and closing the parks and saying that they cannot stay there. Ray kind of talked about this. We did work on policies such as getting IDs not to be a factor to taking a shower. But if we're going to talk about sexual violence, there are young women that do not want to take showers. You know why? Because it is a factor to their safety on sexual violence. So they would prefer to go months without showering so that they don't encounter sexual violence in the streets. This is what we're seeing in-house. In a very unfortunate way. So building that more comprehensive policy that is not building laws that are against the impoverished, right? The reality is that it's a class issue and we're building laws to basically attack people for being poor, particularly young people. So some of the things that we've had a total impact of 5.6 million people, our state's population, because we've built policy that has been that comprehensive. Thank God to CDPHE for funding this wonderful work. We have provided schools with resources for safety. We've started and still continue to start GSAs and do hotspotting work through that. One district actually decided to change modules in their comprehensive sexual education. We had a district, the biggest district that we have in Colorado Springs, have committed to implementing all gender restrooms in all of their facilities. How that might look is something that we need to talk about, because the reality is just because you have all gender restrooms does not mean it's accessible to everyone. If it's one restroom next to the principal's office and all of your classes are in a different building, you're at a different disenfranchisement. So it has been also about following up and holding people accountable of what that looks like. We've also done many testimonies around many bills around, actually right now we're working on a foster care bill, right? To make sure that queer folks can actually not only foster folks, but people that are actually going to foster care queer young people are trained to a certain magnitude, right? And have an open and inclusive household. We've made changes to all gender cabins when it comes to camping experiences. We're continual care of graduating seniors. We have tried to changes in how they arrest trans people in general in sexual violence. So right now we work closely with CSPD to build inclusive policy as to if you go and there's a domestic violence issue and living in a very colonized mindset, you might say this person looks aggressive for these reasons. Maybe they look masculine, or maybe they're a big Black man. Who knows what bias you might have implicit or explicit, right? So how do we build policy that's not going to make sure it's disenfranchising the people that might be abused in those spaces, right? And how do we hold those people accountable? Implementing policy of what is it, swimming, and what is it, looking at all of the policies that have been written against trans and non-binary folks. The reality is that we live in a society that has not been kind to queer folks in general, and this is embedded into that, right? And very simply, implemented policy of pronouns in your forms, and I have this conversation all the time with organizations. Do you have somewhere where you can put pronouns? Do you introduce yourself with pronouns? Do your name tag say your name and your pronouns? Does your email signature say pronouns? Because this engages the community in a whole nother level, right? And how necessary is it to know gender in your organization, right? And where are the fixations around gender? Even more importantly, as a staff member, do you feel included as a queer person in those spaces, right? Because sometimes people say, Taisha, how can we build more inclusion? That word is very triggering for me right now, right? Because the reality is that we think by hiring more Black and brown folks, we think by hiring more queer people that we're being inclusive. But if you don't have an embedded culture that is inclusive, you're actually hurting Black and brown people and queer people, right? Because they're going to go into a space that's not fit, doesn't feel necessarily safe. These are some of the stuff that we've done at Inside Out. We relaunched our Safe at Schools. I've trained over almost 3,000 people last year, and we've done a lot of policy recommendations. We also have supported and also organized around trans visibility here locally, which was something that was never seen in Colorado Springs, and also around Black Lives Matter. Moving forward in upstream prevention, I've named some of those things. For me, it's always taking on those conversations of difficult conversations around comprehensive sexual education. We need to start using the word penis and vagina. We need to start using that sex does not have to look like penetration, right? We need to build the understanding that even heterosexuals have problems with toxic relationships. Let's just name that. This is not a queer problem, right? And I think Tori was really naming this. It's not only about representation. That's not enough. Guess what? You know, people want to sing a good old song that our VP is brown. Yay, she is brown. Okay. It didn't change my life. I'm sorry. I woke up the next day saying, oh, we still got a long fight to go. It's a long way, right? When we also talk about upstream prevention, we have to realize, particularly in conservative spaces, such as the one that I live in, what we are seeing is that on a national basis, on a federal basis, we're making more inclusive policy. And you know what's happening locally? People are becoming more transphobic. So they're tweeting, they are going on social media, they're in city council, literally being transphobic. We are seeing these behaviors. So as much on a national basis, we're seeing some change. And for the queer community, sometimes that's very little bit of change, not enough change. On a local level, unfortunately, we're not seeing that change. We're actually seeing a spike in racism, classism, and homophobia and transphobia. Some of that upstream prevention has to do with comprehensive sexual education. One of the stats that I used was that the reality is that we know statistically that if we were giving some comprehensive sexual education to young people, women would be 56% less likely to have a sexual violent, traumatizing situation occur during college if we had comprehensive sexual education. Because the reality is that through a hotspotting done in Columbia University, we realized that people started to believe that if you sat on a dormitory bed in Columbia University, that you were saying yes to sex. Which we know, if you know a dormitory room, there ain't a lot of places to sit, right? So when we talk about environmental factors, when we talk about built culture around these things, we have to realize that it's a little bit more deeper than just saying, this is a quick fix, right? So upstream prevention is actually telling your schools we need comprehensive sexual education. It is when you're giving therapy, talking about sexual education. Why not, right? It is about providing those pieces in general for our society. And to me, those are pieces of upstream prevention that we do here at Inside Out. For instance, there has been policy that has been written to have comprehensive sexual education. And as Inside Out, what we decided is, guess what? We're gonna go into these spaces and say, hey, are you doing comprehensive sexual education? What does comprehensive sexual education look like for you, right? Can we give you resources? Can we train you how to give comprehensive sexual education, right? And in the past also, all gender restrooms, also destigmatizing the issue with restrooms and queer folks, right? Like even those conversations can bring a robust understanding to build more comprehensive policy around the safety of young people and queer people. I love to use this graph right now. It's my favorite graph. The reality is that we have to get away from allyship. Allyship is just saying I have a gay flag and that I will respect your pronouns. Because of the violence that we are seeing in the queer community, because the reality is that I live in a state that I need to have penetration and also assault and battery in sexual violence to actually have and be able to call the police in any way or be protected. We don't need allyship. I don't need allyship. I need accomplice. I need accomplices. I need people that are going to be in every single space saying, what about the queer kids? What about pronouns? What about comprehensive sexual education? What about queer education, right? Like the reality is that we have been unfortunately lived in a society that does not talk about queer people, that do not talk about Black and brown people, that do not talk about indigenous people, like two-spirit folks that live in our society and have to have a whole agency, honestly, that is working towards sexual education because we do not care about indigenous folks that are seeing high numbers of sexual violence. And the reason why it's seeing it because we brought colonization to different islands. Like the reality is that the way we show up, we have to show up as authentically. Another way of being accomplice is that you have to keep on educating yourself. You're never woke enough. I'm sorry, I am never woke enough. I am continuously reading. I have books right now around me about being queer and Black and feminism and how do all those things pieces come together? How do I show up as an advocate and accomplice? Because the reality is that I hold a lot of power. I hold a lot of privilege. And it's time for us to take our privilege and dismantle all of these pieces that are really oppressing all of us, right? And so that is that liberation piece. I think it's about looking at your agency when you move forward and looking at all the policies that were not meant for Black and brown folks, for people that come from a certain background, which means you want a master's for someone to do administrative assistant work, come on with it. Like what is going on there, right? Which is classism, right? And then that third component of how comprehensive is my organization towards pronouns, towards educating my staff, towards building a safe and creating a safe space. So I see there's a lot of blinking in the chat. That's my last piece of the slide. Are we leaving questions or anyway, feel free, I will drop my email on the chat. Thank you so much for giving this time. I wanna thank Ray for being so amazing and supporting all of the work that we do in Colorado Springs. I wanna also thank Darylyn, she, her pronouns. She's our Safe at Schools coordinator. So proud of the work that we're have the capacity of doing. I want to thank all of the Colorado grantees that are doing dope work. If you don't know what we're doing out in Colorado, we are trying to make things as inclusive and as safe for folks as possible in a very traditional place that hasn't been safe, right? And I want to thank Tori and Ashley for continuing the work that you guys are doing and bringing the space so that people can learn more about these things. And thank you so much. Have a great day.
Goddess Taisha, I want to thank you and you're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat too. That this was a really affirming and motivating conversation for folks. So just really appreciate both you and Ray bringing all of your wisdom and attention to today. We are going to ask one more question of our audience. We're going to put it in the chat and ask you all to answer that while we introduce Connor and Mariana. Kind of building off of Goddess Taisha's last slide of, we know that folks have privilege in certain spaces where they may not have otherwise. So how can you prioritize opportunities to expand and or enhance centering LGBTQ plus communities in your work to prevent violence? How can you leverage that to make sure that these violence prevention programs are doing what they can to promote safety for LGBTQ plus folks? I also want to uplift from our earlier conversation, and then Connor and Mariana, we're coming to you. And it's been a really awesome conversation in the chat, so I have to scroll a little bit to find it because I don't want to misstate anything. I want to uplift what Hema said. They said, I want to gently challenge the thought that gender neutral pronouns is not the only form of prevention. I agree with that. However, many cis-het folks, especially in the medical system, struggle with this, and this is an easy action. As a gender nonconforming man on this call, misgendering equals violence and harm that ends up with many youth not accessing the services they need or want. So I really want to thank you for uplifting that, Jaime, and I also want to thank you for, I'm uplifting this out loud so folks who aren't reading the chat can go back and follow. They put a link in the chat to a resource on pronouns from the University of Milwaukee. So if folks want to check this out, go at your own leisure. Just wanted to uplift some of the conversation that was happening earlier. And finally, we want to welcome our guests from Smile. We have Connor and we have Mariana here. And I believe I'm passing it to Mariana first. Is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome.
So I do not have my own slides. So if you could do the clicking for me, that would be amazing. Hi, everybody. My name is Mariana Velasquez. I use she, her pronouns. I am originally from Mexico and been in the DC area for about 6 years. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. And for those of you that do not know Smile or haven't heard from Smile, we are an organization that focuses on LGBTQ empowerment through service, advocacy, and different community resources. So we work specifically in the DMV area, the Department of Motor Vehicles, but DC, Maryland, and Virginia, working in different capacities to help LGBTQ youth. We have a very extensive housing program, which I'm a part of. And I wanted to share a little bit about the work that we're doing and kind of build up on everything that Ray and Goddess Taisha have been sharing that has been amazing and very eloquently put. I think that the Safe Spaces title that I wanted to start with is highlighting that safety is the bare minimum. If we focus on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if we focus on, basic trauma work, safety is at the bottom. And safety a lot of times is created by, becoming a safe person and implementing those campaigns that promote trusted adults, that promote work to assure that youth in general have that bare minimum. And when we do that, a safe person becomes an advocate for safe spaces, an advocate for that work that can truly empower youth. However, it's just the bare minimum. So my goal and my work is to go beyond safety in order to create intentionality, in order to create that proactive work, that really transformative work. And all of these elements that you're seeing on the screen, the healing, the awareness of the intersectionality, the education, intentionality, collaboration, and knowledge. We've talked about this before in this presentation, but it is important to address that safety, bare minimum, and that in a lot of the times, not having the bare minimum creates harm. And even having the bare minimum can create harm because we come from a society that has been colonized. So it is pretty easy to fall into those patterns without knowing it. So it's about creating safe persons, starting from ourselves. Can you turn into the next slide, please? Thank you. So prevention beyond education. Again, I'm not gonna bore you with the statistics because I know that all of you are very familiar, but we are a program that works with specifically LGBTQ youth. And we see a lot of the times that intersectionality, that it's not just your LGBTQ with everything that it entails. You're LGBTQ, and a lot of the times you are a person of color. A lot of the times you have intensive trauma history caused by homophobia, by like a lot of family trauma, by discrimination, by you name it, any possible trauma comes in the doors when these people come into the doors. So it's important to acknowledge that we cannot operate in our prevention work from the same level. We cannot just say like, hey, this is where everybody's coming in. This is the curriculum I'm gonna give them. This is the education that I have. I have my safe dates curriculum. I have, we cannot just operate from a baseline. We have to look at each individual and see, hey, I am not just giving primary prevention. I am here implementing secondary prevention, tertiary prevention at the same time, because youth will come in with already a trauma history. It's not just preventing trauma, it is addressing the trauma and creating that comprehensive work at the same time. It's gonna force us to become sort of superheroes, but we have to create that awareness that the people that we work with, especially the most vulnerable or underserved populations, already come with that, are already carrying that. So it is really important to just come into the work with saying, what point am I operating from? Where am I at? What's my privilege? What's my knowledge of LGBTQ issues, race issues, economic issues, policy issues? Everything plays a role in this. And who am I meeting? Where are they from? How did they grow up? Not knowing the other person really helps us tackle these issues. I grew up in Mexico. I grew up Catholic. Are those things part of my intersectionality? Yes. Are those things that have high level of trauma? True, that happens. So even within intersectionality, a person can identify with multiple identities, but those identities can have positive or negative connotations because we are complex individuals. So it's really important to acknowledge these realities when we go into our prevention work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So into this awareness, we need to understand not only from, I care about people, I want to make a difference, I want to help survivors, I want to implement prevention work, not only from this perspective, but going beyond and understanding, what are the root causes? How can we really implement change from a deep perspective? And like I said at the beginning, like that change and that comprehensive education and that comprehensive transformation of our understanding of gender and sexuality and race issues comes from understanding where those issues come from and how have they been perpetuated through history. So, an example that is really close to me is the example of machismo. It's an attitude that is highlighted in the Hispanic population that, makes masculinity toxic, makes masculinity superior, degrades women, degrades people of color, degrades members of the LGBTQ community. And I encountered it. People around me encounter it. But a lot of the times in working with these specific populations, sometimes there's an unawareness that this issue exists. So when you go back to the origins of machismo, you can go back to, the discovery of America, where Native Americans, indigenous communities were living and got colonized, and, Western European men said, this is the way that a man should be. So you don't fit the criteria. So indigenous communities were like, okay, how can we fight back? So there was this phenomenon of overcompensation of, in order to gain power, we need to, act differently, show that we're strong. And this phenomenon was created originally from a place of trauma. So it's important to realize, what are those roots? What are those roots behind our social issues today that our young people are facing today, that our young people might not be aware of the generational trauma that we've been bringing for generations. So it's important to just, create that awareness and become more knowledgeable in who are the population that we're serving, because prevention work is not going to look the same wherever we go. It's important to say, hey, let's tackle these issues in a way that addresses everybody, but that does not erase the populations that they need it the most. So if we go to the next slide, I really like this framework because it's based on, gender inclusions, gender transformation, which is the goal. And it kind of poses different levels of gender awareness, because you encounter the folks, like I grew up in a country where probably homophobia is a little bit more pervasive, and you encounter that defensiveness. But we also see that in our communities here in America. I mean, what happened today in Arkansas is, appalling. I still can't believe I had to take a moment, because I'm like, I cannot comprehend why. I cannot understand the extent of the impact of how deep discrimination runs through. And I think through this lens that starts with being gender unaware, that starts with, I don't get that LGBTQ, YZ stuff, which is a comment that we've all heard. It's a comment that we are, we have all been exposed to, not just LGBTQ folks. We've all known somebody that's like, oh yeah, that ABCDEFG stuff. And that's basically gender unaware, gender oppression, not understanding, even the difference between sexuality and gender, because both populations, a trans person, a gender non-conforming person, a lot of the times the issues that they face are very different from someone that, is bisexual, is lesbian. Like, it's not necessarily the same things. They're very different, but it's like, okay, the different thing. And if we add the layers of, race, socioeconomic status, trauma, different types of victimization, substance use, like, if we don't acknowledge the whole picture, then starting at this point of gender unawareness, obviously it's extremely damaging. And then we move into like, hey, a little bit further up the continuum. We're like, okay, we can mention these identities. We can include them in the text we're writing. We can just, acknowledge that they're there to look good for image, for, grant requirements. But at the same time, that's it. Like, we wash our hands and say, we put it out there and that's it. That's what the world is doing today. So that's what we need to do. And that can be, that also is damaging, because it just portrays that, hey, yeah, it creates and highlights that sense of otherness, which can be, it can perpetuate those cycles of discrimination and hate ultimately. And then we move into, gender awareness, that bare minimum, that ticking a box. And a lot of the times, very well-intentioned people that are like, okay, how can I integrate LGBTQ content? Well, maybe I'll put an example in my curriculum, and there we go. But that's not necessarily comprehensive education. And even then, that's not even prevention, because as we have discussed, and as we had amazing speakers that have highlighted, prevention goes beyond education. Prevention touches a lot of different areas. And then we move into gender inclusivity, which I think in the world of prevention, there's a lot of preventionists in this role, where it's like, hey, we are actively wanting to do something, actively creating those spaces, actively, seeking to represent, actively, wanting to increase representation, actively working with our staff and organizations in hiring practices. And all of this is really good and needed. But like I said, we're working towards right now safety, and safety is just the baseline. So there's always so much more that we can do to integrate and create a more gender inclusive culture. And there's a danger of tokenizing somebody, or of like still othering that, so we have to really be intentional in creating the spaces and creating the and creating, the language and transforming that language in order to really be addressing the real issues. And in order to become that gender transformative, which is a little bit like Goddess was saying about becoming real accomplices, becoming proactive, building conversations with communities, breaking from the bubbles of what's been given to us, breaking from the systems of what's been given to us, and saying, does this really work? Does it really work for my community? Does this curriculum really apply? Or, I need to reframe my understanding of gender, or I need to become more educated in this particular issues. So it's going beyond and saying, how can I transform the culture? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Smile in the next slide, specifically with our housing program, which is, implementing
Mariana.
that. Yes.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt, because this is all such great information, and you're getting a lot of praise in the chat about how this lens is really helpful to move folks along. I do want to acknowledge that we only have 5 minutes left and we haven't heard from Connor yet. So
I'm so sorry.
No worries. No.
Yes. No,
yeah, if you wouldn't mind just doing maybe 30 seconds on this one, and then we'll reintroduce Connor.
I can do definitely that. I'm so sorry. I sometimes get really excited when I talk. But yeah, just kind of in our work at Smile, we're working towards creating that specific person-centered approach in which we can provide that healing, that culturally sensitive practices, like psychotherapy that is not traditionally talk therapy, but that is culturally informed and really acknowledges that intersectionality, and promoting that advocacy with other service providers to assure that our LGBTQ youth actually have not only inclusivity, but accessibility, and that they really feel welcome in the spaces that they work in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. This was a really great lens and conversation about connecting healing and prevention and bringing folks along the way. So I know a few folks have said that they will stay on if we need more time. Ashley, I invite you to interrupt. Connor, maybe 10 minutes. I know we'll go a little bit over. Ashley, do you have any feelings about that?
If that works for our guests, that's absolutely fine with me.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Great.
I've been really enjoying hearing what everybody has to say. I'm learning a lot. So my name is Connor Hagel. I am the LGBTQ service navigator. I work for SMILE, but I work specifically in Montgomery County, Maryland, with youth 16 to 24, specifically who are having issues around education and employment. And the program is open to all youth, but I work specifically to address the unique barriers that LGBTQ youth face when accessing school and employment opportunities. I've been working with LGBTQ youth for about a decade now. I spent over 8 years working in a shelter in New York City called the California Center, which works with homeless LGBTQ youth along various programs, housing programs, and drop-in center programs. So I've seen a lot. I also am a queer trans man, so I have a very extensive experience across the spectrum of things as far as masculinity goes. I identified as a lesbian for 10 years. So there's very unique representations of masculinity, even in the LGBTQ community, in women's communities, men's communities, communities of color, things like that. And so if you can go to the next slide. A lot of this is pretty obvious, and a review of a lot of things that a lot of other people said. But toxic masculinity, a lot of times men or masculine people feel like they need to prove their masculinity through misogyny, bullying, and fighting. Men are not encouraged to share their feelings, and so as a result, they don't learn to communicate on an emotional level. So in intimate relationships, they don't really know how to talk with their partner about their feelings, whether their partner is a man or a woman or a gender non-conforming person. If someone has been socialized to be a man, they aren't supposed to talk about those things. They aren't supposed to express those things. And so it leaves a big gap in communication. Also, as far as mental health goes, not learning to have these conversations, not being willing to acknowledge any sort of issues that folks are having, it makes it much harder to process any type of trauma or depression or other feelings that people are having. As was mentioned, it contributes to superiority, which is not only against LGBTQ community, but other racial and ethnic minorities. And yes, I apologize for using men. More masculine experiences. And things like boys will be boys. It just means that there are no consequences. We don't teach understanding and compassion to young boys. When I was in high school, I was in this technology and engineering class, which was basically shop class. And I was one of only 2 girls. Everyone else in the class was a guy. And I was consistently sexually harassed, had lewd comments made about me, insulted, ignored. And then the other girl in the class, she was always asking the guys for help and kind of playing dumb. And one time we were alone, we were working on an extra period, and she knew everything. And I never spoke up about any of the harassment or anything because I was sort of just raised that that's the way, boys are. So both of our experiences were negatively impacted just because of what is considered masculine. We were sort of invading this traditionally male space. This was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And those were the experiences that we had to go on. So if you can go to the next slide. So because there isn't a, test at birth to find out what someone's gender identity and sexuality are, children are raised in the society's dominant culture, which again perpetuates these misogynistic views of women, these ideas of what are masculine, things like that. So LGBTQ youth see these stereotypes. So first of all, it can lead to internal homophobia. There's also a lot of discrimination and disdain in the gay community between masculine or bi-masculine men for effeminate gay men, regardless of whether they are on the transgender spectrum or anything like that. You see like mask for mask or no femmes on people's dating profiles. You don't have to want to date someone, but you don't need to sort of outwardly express that disdain or be degrading for them. Also transphobia. As a trans man in gay spaces, I am very often ignored. Not usually, I haven't really been directly insulted, but there's, it's definitely othering. It's not very accepting. And the same thing like with trans women, it's like, there are different spaces in gay men's communities where they may or may not be accepted, whether as a trans woman, they identify as wanting to, date men or wanting to date women. So that is pervasive across the queer and trans spectrum. Children can be punished or shamed for acting in ways contrary to their gender assigned at birth, which leads to stress, depression, and fear of coming out. Boys are supposed to play sports and girls are supposed to be like, soft and quiet. And so boys might not want to join the musical theater or, the glee club or go to art class or things like that. Even though they actually want to, they are afraid of what their peers are going to think. Youth who are butch or trans and exploring their identities, they, are learning from what they see. And so trying to make sure that they're positive representations of masculinity, that they don't have to be, aggressive or degrading towards women, are important lessons for them to learn. All right, and you can go to the next slide. So how do we do better? Most of that comes around learning and being willing to call things out. It's not always easy, but this is your introduction. You do not now know everything that you need to know about making safe spaces for LGBTQ youth. It's a very ongoing process and things are constantly changing. Just because you put LGBTQ sex ed in your curriculum a year ago does not mean that in 2 years it is still going to be up to date. Things are constantly changing. Lean into your discomfort. The things that kind of irk us and bother us the most and we're the most resistant to are often the things that we don't actually want to identify in ourselves. So it's easier for us to just say, hey, these things don't exist. One thing that I didn't put in my slide that I wanted to also bring up is and give mention to is the importance of empowering sex workers and decriminalizing sex work. So many LGBTQ youth engage in sex work for any number of reasons. And when we criminalize and persecute and look down upon that, then it makes those spaces also less safe for those young people. And that's something that I have seen with my youth who do sex work, that certain staff members will not be open or will be very judgmental. And as a result, they don't then talk about their experiences. So they don't have any sort of way to talk about harm reduction and doing sex work safer, things like that. Calling out folks, not just ignoring that homophobic meme that your brother-in-law posted on Facebook. It's your responsibility to be like, you know what, that's bullshit, excuse me. That's just wrong. You need to be able to be willing to have those conversations. I was in one of my previous jobs, I was working with homeless adults, and one of my colleagues was a woman, and one of the clients, a grown man, he was like hitting on her, and he was being very inappropriate, and in his mind he was complimenting and flirting with her, and she was like kind of, she had to work with him, so she was trying to be polite, but she was clearly uncomfortable, and I was, my desk was right next to hers, and so I'm like, hey, stop it. Like, this is not appropriate. This woman is here to work with you. This is not the place for you to engage in those kinds of conversations. And he like pushed back, and then I pushed back, and I'm just like, no, she deserves your respect. She's here to help you. Like, that's what your, relationship is. And after he left, she, came over to me, and she was like so appreciative, because, women in these kind of, in these industries and stuff like that, nobody ever calls out people that they're working with, especially masculine folks, when they do kind of cross those boundaries. And she was so surprised that I was willing to do that. Letting people know that it's okay to call you out if you say or do something offensive. I don't know, everything about every trans person's, identity. I don't know everything about, disability awareness and, face things that, Black people or people of color face. And so I want people to know that if I get something wrong, like, I'm not going to fight someone. I'm not going to attack them. Like, if you tell me that I said something that's messed up, like, I'm going to take that to heart, and I'm going to use that as a learning experience. Especially with youth, there's that inherent power dynamic. And a lot of times adults are afraid to not know things or feel like they're wrong. I apologized to a group of young people once, and they were like, several of them were just sort of taken aback, because they were just not used to seeing adult authority figures like apologize and acknowledge that something they said, was offensive to them. Like, I didn't mean to be, it was just, I didn't know what language that group preferred to use. And that built a better relationship, instead of fighting people like, that's not what I meant, that's not what I said. Like, if you just say, oh, I'm sorry, I'll do better in the future, that's going to continue to build that trust. And being willing to have hard conversations about bullying. I think a lot of times, especially when bullying is of LGBTQ youth, there might be punishment, but there's not actually a conversation, because folks who are not who might be cis or het, aren't comfortable acknowledging anything about LGBTQ youth existing. They don't have the language for it. And as a result, they just avoid it. So they might just be like, there'd be no punishment at all, or there might just be the standard punishment that there would be for any other incident of bullying or fighting, which doesn't do anything to correct the mindset and the, emotional impact that young person's bullying has. Also, talking to the young person who might have been at the victim side of that, to make sure that they know that those kinds of things won't be tolerated, so that they'll be willing to come forward, is also very important. And I think that is about time. So I will stop right there.
Thank you, Connor. We're so glad that we got to hear from you, and I really appreciate your vulnerability on this as well, to kind of share that process that you've been through, and your experiences too. You're getting a lot of affirmation for what you were saying in the chat as well. Is Samantha saying punishment without education is useless? Folks are saying, Rachel's saying it's so powerful when we are not only able to apologize for a quote misstep, but to acknowledge that we will change moving forward. So I really appreciate you, bringing all of this into the conversation as well. I think it was a really great way for us to wrap up today. So thank you. I know that we are over time. So we're going to have a moment of like facilitation transparency with you all. We had another panel conversation to planned, and we will follow up with our guests and see what's comfortable for a continuation of that for them, because there were really, really great gems that we had planned on discussing, but want to be respectful of everyone's schedules too. We had a couple of text chat questions that we wanted to get your perspectives on. So what we're going to do is we're going to add those to our evaluation survey that you will receive a few minutes after this web conference is over. In that same email with the evaluation survey, at the end of the evaluation survey, you'll receive a link to a certificate of participation for being on this web conference today. So you'll see a couple of additional questions in there too, just so we can have folks kind of marinate on what they learned today. There was a lot of information here, a lot of inspiration here, and we want to hear how you all are going to apply that to your work. I also want folks to know that tomorrow is the Trans Day of Visibility. For more resources on healing and preventing violence within trans and non-binary communities, check out the resources at Forge Forward, in addition to the resources that our presenters provided today too. And Ashley, I am going to invite you back to close us out.
Oh gosh, well, thank you, Tori. I just really want to, again, echo you in thanking all of our guests today. Ray, I totally agree with you. It was just so wonderful for you all to just kind of, speak from your hearts and your experiences. And I just feel very grateful and honored that you shared that with us today. So thank you. And to our audience, I mean, gosh, there were over 300 of you. Clearly, this is a conversation that, needs to be continued. And we had so much more that we wanted to get to. So we will figure something out, but I just want to thank you all too for your insights and sharing with us and the work that you all are doing in your local communities. So with that, we look forward to seeing you on a future Prevent Connect Web conference, but in the meantime, you know how to reach us, hopefully. You can email us at info@preventconnect.org. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and week, and we will we'll share space with you again soon. Take care, everyone.